Hello, Global Theater. My name is Jerry Fialka. Today is October 5, 2021. It's Laughtears number 11. That's because 1 plus 1 equals 11. If you believe that,
Woo!
you're also on Rob Grant's amazing podcast. It's called I'm Probably Wrong About Everything. What are you
Brought to you by our sponsor, water. Drink
Yeah.
it.
What are you wrong about today, Rob?
Being late. Like, is
Oh,
anybody late? Do you know what I mean? Like, you gotta be here at 8:30. Well, what if I'm there at 8:32? Am I like, is the world gonna collapse? I don't
you
know.
know, I told you this. My friends who are homeless on Venice Boardwalk
Yeah.
got housed in the fanciest like buildings right on the boardwalk. They cost like $300 to $500 a night. So in
Mhm.
order to get them off living on the boardwalk, they gave them these vouchers to live in these places. So it's pretty smooth. Hey Matt,
How's it going, Jerry?
Hey, Matt, how's it going?
this is
Good to
Rob.
meet good to meet you, Rob.
We've
Nice to meet
already
you too.
started, so that was like you appeared out of the blue. And
The
thank
ether.
God you're here.
Ether.
And I'm just finishing this intro story on timing. So it was beautiful. My friends are living not homeless on the boardwalk anymore, but in the fancy hotels right on the boardwalk because of the vouchers from the rich people go, we got to get these shantytown people out of here and house them. So these people who've lived on the boardwalk for 20 years are living right above where they've lived in fancy hotels overlooking the ocean, and the curfew's 10 p.m. And the guy gets there at 10:01 and he says, "Nope, you can't come in." He goes, "Oh gee, I'm going to have to go sleep on the street where I've lived for the last 20 years anyway."
Yeah.
So, Matt, it is a pleasure and honor for you to, for us to have you here today on Probably Wrong About Everything, because you're right about a lot. And I am always as respected your
It's
comprehensive.
always by accident.
Yeah, well, there you go. You have
Right by
comprehensive
accident.
awareness by accident. But you articulated something today, and I thought it would be a good place to start because Rob said, in the sense of I can do a podcast, that eye contact and verbal exchange is a pretty good way to communicate. And
If
today in
not
our
the way, yeah.
yeah, in our group, you said the only technology for feedback through some sort of Marshall McLuhan thing. What did you say there? Because we're going to go into Facebook and regulations, but what did you say there? Can you recall?
Yeah, sure. I'm pretty sure it's in McLuhan. It's in the end. It's toward the end of Understanding Media, I think. It might be toward the beginning of Gutenberg Galaxy. But the question is that sort of posed to him, or that he's answering, is okay. You're cataloging all of these different media, and each of them presents a new set of problems and a new set of opportunities and displaces the last, and so on and so forth. You know, short of, you can't be a Luddite. So what's the solution, or what's the medium with the most? And he's talking in terms of the fact that electronic media are facilitated and managed and controlled by large corporations, and therefore they're lacking in their feedback loop function, or it's a very, very it's a very, very protracted feedback that, some messages might get back, and if they're in control of presenting what they present, they hear.
They're the
And
gatekeepers.
so they're the gatekeepers. Yeah.
Yeah.
Just as like the priest was the gatekeeper in a different era. Right. And so, he's saying the only technology that allows for sufficient feedback that allows a person to exercise their own will and participate in the processing of content sufficiently is the human dialogue back and forth. That there's space that someone can be interrupted, they can ask questions, they can refute, or they can correct themselves, they can change their minds. Now, I think when we get into like things like, you know, the academic debate forum, right, where you have two people on either side of a dais arguing with one another and taking a position as if it's political territory or military like territory, they're not really in dialogue. They've each prepared their position. They're not about to change their mind. Oh yeah, I hadn't thought about that. Right? That's not what's in the game there. But yeah, so I think that's what McLuhan was saying, and that we need to always come back to that. And wherever we have that, we need to kind of preserve it. So for whatever failures of like the American court system, it still presents, at least before COVID, the opportunity to confront your peers or be with your peers and confront your accusers, right? And that's technically open dialogue. The judge there curtails exactly what can happen, and it's flawed. It's not like meeting someone at a coffee shop and having a legitimate, authentic and authentic conversation in which everyone is given the benefit of the doubt and is in good faith and not a psychopath trying to steal, right? That's where real dialogue and real learning and where communication has its most beneficent potential.
Dude, that was so well put, because hold on, Rob, one second. Yeah. I'll just give you an example. Frank Zappa was on the radio, talk radio, call-in radio, which is changing the electronic medium of radio to a two-way thing instead of coming at you in one way.
Yeah.
And a woman called up, and this is during censorship PMRC days, and said, Frank says, look, if everybody's listening to the lyrics of rock music, most of them are about love. Why isn't everybody loving each other? Are they listening to the lyrics? And so that was a good point by Frank. And a woman called up and says, Frank, that's because all those songs are about puppy love. It's not real love. And that was beautiful. And he went, yeah, that's a good point. So, you know, Marshall did that. He would be in an argument or a debate with someone, and then he would change his mind, and they would go, you can't do that. You got to hold your ground and believe what you believe. So it's really beautiful when somebody like Matt comes along and reads McLuhan and tells me what I don't know and enlightens it and like flushes it out. But Rob, before you know, this is the point I want you to tackle, then make your point is, I want to dig into this is, why is this big issue of Facebook now? We have to regulate it. They have to regulate it. Who has to regulate it? Self-regulation, government regulation. And isn't this the history of all the three mediums? Spoken word, printed word, electronic word. Spoken word is when your daughter, Rob, goes to school, you're going to say, honey, don't say these words in front of your teacher. That's regulating her. You're the parent. When she starts writing her papers, her essays for college, don't use that word. I'm regulating your content. She's going to start typing text, sending in her papers. Don't use these words. So go ahead and say what you were going to say to respond. And we can suss out the bigger.
First of all, Jerry, you're absolutely wrong about everything. Just kidding. No, but yeah. There it is. No, but Matt was bringing up a point that we talked about last time. Now, I'll be completely honest. I live under a rock. I don't really I know there's something going on with Facebook, a big trial or whatever, and I assume it's who dictates the information that's coming in. Is that kind of what it is?
Well, it's not so much who dictates. It's simple. Who's regulating
excuse
content?
Me,
yeah. Dictate, regulate.
Yeah, because there is a degree of censorship. Like, is it free speech if I can't be an anti-vaxxer and shoot all these crazy theories out. I'm not an anti-vaxxer. I've been fully vaccinated and I'm still alive. So I guess it works. But anyways, we had talked about last time about asymmetrical versus symmetrical dialogue. And asymmetrical dialogue is when it's like me just going through my endless feed of like, oh, look how wonderful everyone else's life is but my own. Like, I'm such a loser, right? Versus symmetrical dialogue, which is the back and forth. And going back to what you're saying, Matt, is that symmetrical dialogue is really where the magic happens. But this asymmetrical dialogue, I think that's where this kind of pseudo tribalism kind of comes into fruition, right?
I don't think
this
you need
idea,
to say pseudo, yeah.
Well, but it is fake, but it's becoming real. Like, for example, anti-vaxxers, the people who thought Trump won the election, and then all this kind of crazy stuff that's happening. And there's my value judgment, labeling it as crazy. But when I talk to somebody who's like, I'm against the vaccine and stuff, and it's like, okay, well, why don't you tell me your reasons? And then we're having a dialogue versus, dude, you're batshit crazy. What's wrong with you? But it's like, no, why don't you tell me? But the thing is that once you do that, that's going against the script in there in maybe our minds of like, it's my way and blah, blah, blah. And then when somebody's like, well, why don't you tell me more? They're sort of like, well, I know where you are on this issue. You've been vaccinated. Well, yeah, so what I have, but I want to hear your point, right? I want to listen to you. And it's almost like that is uncommon in our times, again, because of the asymmetrical insemination. It's the way that information is given out. It's asymmetrical, or that's my observation.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. I think it's asymmetrical on every front. I think the only place it's not asymmetrical is, like you say, when you get in personal dialogue with one another. You know, you can see their facial expression when they respond to your thoughts. You know, I mean, just think about the difference between the oral word and the text word, and how frequently and easily you're misinterpreted in text or in email or in a love letter. Because the text does not convey the spirit of the words as they're delivered. There's so much room for interpretation and misinterpretation. The tone is absent. And then also, like, you know, when you do text somebody some information you think is salient and there's no receipt, you're sort of ghosted in it. You know, are you to take it as it wasn't even looked at, or that it was thought irrelevant, or you're being judged, or, you know, and I'm maybe sounding more insecure than I am, but I have become kind of like, I become the crazy uncle who blasts out, you got to read this, you got to read that.
Yeah. Well, nothing's worse than when I say a big paragraph. I text a big paragraph and I get a thumbs up back. I'm like, hey, I asked you like 3 questions.
Yeah.
What the fuck is a thumbs up? Right.
I know. Yeah. And that's interesting because from the age from the 90s and the aughts, when people used email, I mean, so many people just don't even bother checking email anymore, let alone using it as a medium for correspondent letters, which is, you know, how the old guard, all the old gentlemen used to do it in the 90s. Not saying I'm a gentleman, but I love that form. I like to just, I mean, I kind of have no edit filter. And so I kind of like to ramble in that way. It's a great way to express oneself in an epistle almost. And then in that sense, when I'm doing that, I'm kind of not necessarily writing to induce particular responses. I'm kind of saying, well, this is kind of for a posthumous audience.
Well, but that's the other thing, is that what we seem to forget is the history of censorship. And you were speaking back to the ecclesiastical times, but even, you know, war correspondence. If you're like, dude, the Western Front, don't sign up for it, it sucks, they would interpret that and be like, well, don't send that letter. Right now, a couple months back, this book came out. It's called White Fragility, and it was big buzz. And somebody was like, this book is offensive. And I was like, well, it's just being honest. White people are kind of wimp asses or something. I said something like that. It was a joke. And it was shut down instantaneously. And it was like, hey, like, technically I'm considered a white person. I guess I can't say. It was just weird how I could say something and right away it was censored.
Oh, in what platform, what medium was it? You mean censored by
Facebook?
Oh, Facebook cut it out.
It was taken down like right away. I commented on someone's post saying, well, it's because, speaking of white people don't understand this problem because they've never had these experiences. They're weak ass white people. And then it just shut that down right away. And I was like,
yeah, that's funny. Well, I mean, in that sense, I appreciate your brevity, but by the same token, it doesn't leave a lot of room for nuance or 100%. All of that. But but you mentioned Facebook.
I'm a born again man since I've met Jerry.
Oh, funny. No, that's funny. I that's full of irony. Let's see. So you sort of invoked the platform that shall not be named. I'm not a virgin to social media and digital social networking, but I also never got onto that one. But you brought up the events of yesterday, and so just to sort of clarify for the conversation, I've paid a little bit of attention to it, and in terms of the trial aspect of it, it's a congressional review, so it's a show trial. It's inconsequential. It's going to be spinning the particular bullet point media sort of platitudes that need to be spun so that whatever needs to happen, they'll do. And the nuance of it is that there's this conscientious whistleblower from inside the company who was giving testimony and observing that by her experience, and I presume she copied some documents that back her up, I don't know, in which she's able to say resolutely that regardless of political fallout, regardless of social fallout, regardless of better angels, the company invariably took a for-profit stance through all of the traumas of the last, I would imagine, since Obama took office or earlier. But I think she's focusing on when she was involved during the Trump years. And so the funny part was in yesterday's shutdown, it's kind of like, well, was yesterday's shutdown following her 60 Minutes talk 2 days in advance of her congressional presentation? Was it some, wise hacker or some really bad luck that just caused the whole thing to get shut down by removing their DNS register? Moving them from the DNS registry, or was it something else? But one of the things that seems most obvious, if we're being even remotely cynical and observant about how corporations of that scale and that level of military interrelatedness behave, it was almost more like, oh yeah, you wanna try and curtail Facebook's reach and power. Okay, here, fine. See what happens when you don't have it for 6 hours. And that makes everyone go, oh my God, we can't take anything away from them because or creating that narrative envelope.
Amazing, Matt. Can I interrupt? That's what happened in the spring, whatever it's called, a few years ago when Turkey had the revolution and the government said, what's it called?
Arab Spring
or something like that.
Color revolutions.
Yeah, they shut the internet down.
Go ahead. Sorry.
Kids couldn't do their revolution. The young people couldn't do their revolution because they were doing their revolution on cell phones or Instagram or whatever. And all the businessmen held a gun to the government and said, dude, I just lost $1 million. Turn that back on.
Yeah.
And the government goes, oh, okay. Because they're more controlled by big business than kids revolting in the street.
Yeah.
But I think what you said was amazing because both of you are making great observations. And again, Matt, what you're talking about a lot is when we did political research for the last 40 years, someone would say something, we go, what's your source on that? So you'd go the New York Times, or you would go this book or this. So we had, the source, and that would help legitimize it if you liked that source or gave it credibility. But I'm more concerned what both of you said, Rob splitting it asymmetrical, is that a human norm? It's normal for humans to be asymmetrical, and it's normal for humans to censor. Maybe it's not normal. We've invented censoring. We've invented
power structures,
electronic media. Doesn't that in the long run help us develop better critical thinking skills? And I think you go ahead, Matt, you go first because you tackled this today and almost convinced me. Like, no, what they're doing. And like I said, hey, Michael Shields says, why don't we just sell our information to Amazon? That instead of them taking it, why can't we? And I was giving the example of how we used to go in the grocery stores and the barcodes would figure out what we were buying, so they knew what we were buying. Now when we do it on Amazon, everybody freaks out. Oh my God, they know what I'm buying. So I know I'm blending a lot, but isn't the disservice of what we're talking about, Matt, in the long run something that we can utilize to build better critical thinking skills?
I mean, it's kind of it when put into like a sort of philosophical framework, you're kind of petitioning for Gnosticism. You're kind of saying, well, isn't it better to acknowledge that we're living in a prison planet, and that necessitates, or it creates the necessity, increases the necessity to be more critically astute, to discover your own inner liberation? Yeah, I guess. Right? Good. I mean,
right. What's Gnostic mean again?
Gnosticism generally refers to various subcults of earlier Christianity that was generally suppressed and or labeled witchcraft and so forth, and has had a kind of 20th century resurgence. For instance,
I'm agnostic.
Okay, no. So right, right. Agnostic is without gnosis, and gnosis is as the Greeks use it, like knowledge, to most immediately. But like a contemporary pop Gnosticist will generally be meditating on The Matrix and on Philip K. Dick. And if you happen to see the film Mother by Jerry, who was that? By what's his name? Who did Pi and
that is that's we'll think of his name.
That film is very Gnostic. In the Gnostic doctrine, there is, of course, the Yahweh God of the Hebrews, and then the Christians, and then the Muslims, who is the creator. And the Gnostic spin on that is that he's a fake God, that there's a real God above the creator, and the creator doesn't realize he's not the true God. And so it's about sort of escaping that image of the patriarchal power. And the Gnostics tends to be more on the, you can't say patriarchal, matriarchal, but on the non-archal kind of pro-feminine, pro-goddess kind of angle from the old, the Minoan, and prior to that, the more equitable thoughts about divinity.
Yeah.
So that's sort of like that's like a very quick little, very flawed synopsis of Gnosticism.
No, that was good, but then back to the through line is, does it? Yeah, you're saying if I just go, well, if Facebook just regulates themselves, then we can just deal with it. And you're saying no, there's a better way.
Yeah, there's a better way, but so the same way that I sort of look at the congressional hearing as a show trial, I think that the entire way that you're framing the question is a way that you've inherited or adopted, and the construction of that idea that it's either the government regulating or the corporation regulating is a false dichotomy. It's a gauntlet. There's no escape once you get into that gauntlet, and both of them are really bad ideas. It's not an either or. The flaw in the structure is in the centralized and opaque method by which content is managed. Now, if ooh, I just got I just got an echo. The recollection or the image from 1984 of the memory hole is very, very present. And because we have become accustomed to internet companies sort of flagging stuff and then erasing it from civic life without any accountability, or no phone call to call somebody and hear someone's voice and let them know your issue or whatever, or ask them for their human response. We've become accustomed to this idea that censorship and editing and social morality can be regulated invisibly. That's a problem, right? That doesn't happen in the agora. That doesn't happen on the soapboxes or in the central green. And so if the internet, for instance, were to become more equitable for everybody across the board and be an instrument for good and for a self-regulating civic life, then what it would do, and maybe this isn't the answer, but in general, what it would do is it would preserve all dialogue for what is exited. It might not present it on the face. You might have to sort of go behind a layer and say, well, I want to know, what the details of this precedent are so that we can have them consistently across the board. And Oprah has to live by the same rules that everybody else has to live by. Likewise, the decisions themselves would not be done monolithically at the center top of the corporate owner. They would be done by the communities themselves. So that way you could get a diversification of communities of people that are willing to tolerate certain things and say, well, I've got kids, we can't have that kind of language on this version of the internet that I'm using. And whereas for somebody else, if you don't have the access to use the full color of language, you will be fundamentally censoring what is knowable. Yeah.
Because right now, sorry,
ahead,
Jerry.
Rob.
I was going to say, right now, essentially, the filter, the sieve or whatever, through which all this content is being pushed through is Facebook. Is that correct? They are.
Well, they're the behemoth, right? They're the big one.
They're deciding. Yeah.
Yeah, and that's the thing is we seem to have multiple tech giants, right? I mean, technically YouTube is the second biggest social network. But that's an interesting situation where they maintain the comments section. So there's technically a kind of feedback, but good luck trying to find your own comments. There's no way to actually organize and filter and refer to or find your own comments. so what good is it, right? Like they're collecting it and knowing more about you are, and you're not even able to see what you did. And there's Twitter, and there's a number of them in the big gang, of the FANG, or however you want to describe them. But so the idea is that it looks on the face of it like something like a free market, right? Like if you could start your own and you had unlimited funds, you could do another one. But the reality is that there's a really helpful financial model or economic system model that goes by the name of oligopoly. And oligopoly is really good to know about and use and to understand, because an oligopoly is, everyone knows what a monopoly is. An oligopoly is effectively a monopoly that disguises itself as a free market.
Right.
So this started, the first effective oligopolies were in the oil industry.
19th century, right?
Right, but the oligopoly. So when I think this is an armchair history, but I think what happened was Rockefeller's trust was busted. Right, he was not able to run Standard Oil universally everywhere, and so the states busted him up. And so then what he had to do is he had to set up Standard Oil in different states, and they all looked like independent corporations, but it's still him behind it and his decision making behind the whole thing, and it doesn't have to be one man; it can be a whole group of people. And so when did that happen? I was in the 20s or 30s or something when that trust was busted, and so the system of oligopoly was systematized and engineered, and sort of the robust science of artificial intelligence, as it's come to be known, was applied to it in the 70s and 80s. And they called it operations research, which is industrial scheduling, but it utilizes all of the same kind of organic, live changing math that AI does. And it was easy to do in the oil industry, because already all of your products and all of your resources and all your processes were already going on through tubes that you measured, and speed and rates, and so it was already broken down to numbers. Everything was numerical. There was no soft decision making that had to happen. No translation from qualitative to quantitative. It was all quants. And then that succeeded, and then we got the oil embargo, and we got OPEC and the petrodollar, and the petrodollar became the currency for that oligopoly. And after that system was then, I would say, applied to. They sort of went about as pirates and started taking over whole industries and applying this model of centralized control under the aegis of, look, it's a free market. You can invest too. And so, I think they own everything. And so in America, we noticed it without really observing it, or observing it without noticing it, or something. Back in the 80s, when the HMOs took over the health industry. So it used to be independent doctors making independent decisions. The larger hospitals tend to be run by churches or by municipalities. Or religious orders of one sort or another, and of course, what was the guiding principle of medicine from the time of Pythagoras? It was the Hippocratic Oath. That was the benchmark of and then after,
do no harm.
Do no harm. First, do no harm, and then after the Second World War, then at that point, the Nuremberg Code became effective, in which case informed consent became an additional benchmark of ethics.
And what do you sign every time that you start a new account?
That's right. Yes, so that's another matter. That's another matter in terms of your signature and where law is. What am I trying to say? Where there's sort of constitutional law on one side that we all just assume because we learned it in school is the operative law, and then there's civil law, and then there's commercial law. And in commercial law, where you sign your signature, you're giving consent, and whenever you give consent, then you're under commercial law. You're no longer under constitutional law. So this is the reason why that you go to the DMV to get permission to drive the car you presumably bought, and then they're allowed to pull you over and go through your stuff whenever they decide that it's merited. And that wouldn't be the case if the automobile infrastructure were founded on constitutional law. But so the oligopoly system kind of run with the oil titans behind it, usurped the medical industry. And so we've been in the for-profit system ever since, incrementally. And I think by the time, like, for instance, I think you can say that by the time Obama made quote unquote universal health care, then it was very, very clear that the central system was established. And the idea of universal health care, that I think the cynical view is not that you get help, it is that now you are commodified in our system. And now we have your identification, and there's no escape. We own you. Yeah, effectively.
You're making me wish that this water was straight vodka right now.
Cheers.
But is that surveillance capitalism that you brought up earlier? Or
surveillance capitalism plays into this because in some ways the function that oil had in the 20th century in terms of consolidating power has sort of been eclipsed by data, and in data, identity and the confirmation of identity, so the erasure of anonymity of all sorts, allows for us to be the commodity. It's sort of joked about, any social network, that if it's free, then you're the product. That's not an analogy.
And this idea that they don't have to collect any information, we just hand it right over to them.
And we don't read the thing. Yeah, it's all a bait and switch. Jerry mentioned our friend Michael, who talked about how maybe we should sell our data. Well, what he's sort of referring to is, if there were a Fourth Amendment to digital culture, then we would automatically and effectively be in possession of and own our identity and our data at the get-go, at the outset. And then we would have the option to sell it for some kind of return. We could decide at each moment how much we were willing to let go and so forth. But that's not the situation that exists. In the current situation, we've sort of walked into this, but we've walked down the primrose path to discover that it's all been stolen from us, and most people, believe we never owned it in the first place.
That's we read in Finnegan's Wake today. My producers, are they not my consumers? And it's constantly flipped. Are my consumers my producers? Matt, what you brought up was brilliant. And Rob, throw in anything you want. That's like W.C. Fields reading the Bible, going, "Why are you reading the Bible?" And he goes, "I'm looking for the loopholes."
Well,
that's right. Wait. Well, let me just finish. And that's like Michael Moore saying that the Wall Street Journal is the enemy's tip sheet. Now, that's interesting. But I'd like you to delve into another phrase you brought up earlier. After Rob, you put your input in a sec. The other thing I'd love you to touch on, eventually getting to, well, what do we do about all this, is resistance is futile. Where did you get that, Matt? You dropped that today, and I swear, did you say it? Because I think McLuhan got it from an ad.
No. It's any real nerd will know exactly what this is from. It's from Star Trek and the Borg. Yeah. Resistance is futile.
Which actually interesting connection, Matt. If you want to talk about what the Borg is and what they do.
Yeah, and so that's a really present concern. And so well, it's funny because think about what the dialogue happening in Congress and in the public sphere is this idea of either the government having the ability or the corporation to have the ability. I think most people are scared of the government doing it because they imagine the boogeyman of the corrupt government. But what I find interesting is it seems to me that the Westphalian idea of nation states with their governments and their currencies allows, well, one of the principles is that when they're working well, they act to protect the interest of the individuals that constitute them. And in a representative system, there's ostensibly some kind of enough feedback loop where someone's complaint can get heard and that the person's concerns can be represented. And certainly in the case of the emergent monolithic digital culture, there's no such thing as the protection of the individual. Privacy doesn't exist in that world. And so that's why I said earlier, I don't think it's pseudo-tribalism, it's perfect tribalism. Or perfect corporatism. I think that, McLuhan frequently puts those two words together, and to most people, tribal is archaic and without tools, and corporate is, of course, the apotheosis of the institutionalization of people. But really, what they're both concerned with is, and what they both have in common is the relationship of the individual to the group.
Right.
Go ahead, Rob. What were you going to say?
Well, man, my head is spinning right now. But
I know, see it. That's an amazing. That's what media ecology is. Ecology is an organism's relationship with its environment. What McLuhan said is when we invent something, money, it creates an environment. So we have to deal. That's all we can do. We have to deal with
we've created this system
and what we dislike.
Well, our representatives or other people have. We as a species has. Most of us have done nothing but just like dribbled through it and eaten the sugar.
Yeah. We've been pedestrian in it.
Yeah.
But what kind of comes to mind, and right when you sent me this title, without knowing anything about it, of 1 + 1 = 11. Is the scene in 1984 where he interrogates him and says 2 + 2 is 5 or whatever it is. And what comes to mind is the idea of these two novels that have often been compared and contrasted, but really I think it's an amalgamation of the two that we're currently experiencing, of 1984, Orwellian 1984, and Aldous Huxley's A Brave New World. I mean, you keep feeding their dopamine levels and their serotonin. And they're like, yeah, like. That's a Brave New World piece. That's a soma that they're all, I forget if they're drinking it or whatever. But at the same time, there is, a pill. But it seems that there's a surveillance piece of Big Brother in 1984. But then there's also the
pacification.
Thank you, pacification. And they're kind of coming together.
No doubt. Yeah, no, they're both instruction manuals at this point. And that's
exactly.
There's an interesting thing. Well, first, I guess, Rob, Jerry's last comment made me wonder if you've spent much time with McLuhan, with his written word or with his lectures.
I'm getting there. I pick it up, but I'm a big fan, but I need to sit down and read media, understanding media.
That's a good one. Yeah, no, and it is dense, and it takes a while to sort of acclimate to his way of using language.
And I'm dense, and I take a while. So
and you have a kid too, so you have much less time than most people.
That's right.
Okay.
But I'll just read it to her, and she'll look at me anyways.
Oh, that's a great idea. I had a professor once who was keen to hang out with his granddaughter because he was feeling like he would never have a summer with her again. And he was taking the opportunity to read the Iliad. And I was like, man, I wish I had a grandfather like that.
Yeah. He's got it figured out.
He had it figured out. Let's see. But so there, regarding 1984 and Brave New World.
Yeah.
And I'll include Philip K. Dick, all of his books. all of his stories, I should say. In the shifts that happen between the written word and the book, and in the printed book, and in film, there's a really, I think, important quality of experience that shifts. Particularly, when the films are being made by the high art of Hollywood, if you can call it that. And I say high art not because the art is necessarily high art, but because the technology of manipulation and so forth is at its height. Making the money and keeping, cultivating technophilia. So what happens is you read the books and your mind gets to fill in all of the imagery itself, and it's a fantastic thing. The more creative you are, the more colorful, or the more colorful the grays are. Right? But you get to understand the consequences, and you get to think about it in a rich sense in terms of how you identify with that hero and his struggles, or hers. Whereas once it's turned into a film, it begins to perform a lot less like a warning and a lot more like a commercial. Oh, we lost Jerry.
No, I'm here.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
A lot more like a commercial. And even though the scenarios are dystopian, and even though the threats are traumatic, and the challenges impossible to face, you've got these movie stars going through the struggle, and beautiful people populating it, or beautiful grotesque people, and you've got all the shining lights, and you've got the imagery of a future by profoundly wonderful artists, right? And the whole thing is like, wow, it'll be great. I hope I'm not that guy. Right. And so, people talk about predictive programming. I think it's just the way that art works in certain ways it does soften you up and pacify you. I don't know if you guys have seen either produced by Hulu, The Handmaid's Tale, or produced by HBO, the Watchmen series. There was one other that was really... One other, maybe it'll come to mind, but these were made before lockdown.
Yeah.
And if you watch them before lockdown, you're like, wow, man, intense television show. If you watch it after lockdown, you're like, holy shit, they were paving the way.
Right.
That is totally.
And you're like, in Watchmen particularly, with the masks and the racial inversion that happens in that, and then some of the high technology, in terms of mind control, like whoa, and also
well, you said mind control perfect, because we're talking the same wavelength here. Our person we look up to is Robert Guffey. He wrote a book called All American Mind Control, and he wrote an article for Paranoia magazine that said all the science fiction writers worked for the man, Jules Verne, H.G. Wells, and Philip K. Dick. But Philip K. Dick was the only one going, I'm not working for the man. They're trying to brainwash me. And he was paranoid to this point. But it was like they prepare the way. That's why the CIA studied Finnegan's Wake, because it was predictive in a metaphorical way, that you could say, how do we socially engineer people? Well, you can do that with spoken word, printed word, electronic word. But what you said was great, because socialist John Basil Barnhill said, where the people fear the government, you have tyranny. Where the government fears the people, you have liberty.
Yeah.
V for Vendetta, 2005 film, paraphrased it. People should not be afraid of their governments. Governments should be afraid of their people. Which, that's like, good luck. But, I've got I've got to run in 8 minutes. You guys can keep going, but I just wanted to say that we can continue this conversation because we brought up a lot. And I really want to go into like that typical question we always pursue. Well, what can we do about this? And you nailed it at the beginning, Matt, and Rob has so greatly facilitated it. And then that is have conversation. Have conversation and eye contact. And this conversation doesn't stop. It goes on YouTube and it's continued and it can be watched, or we can say, let's start part 2. But just in sort of closing my part is, how do you determine what is true? You know, Schopenhauer said an amazing thing that's sort of like you bringing up Handmaid's Tale, which is Margaret Atwood, who studied at McLuhan's feet. You know, she went to Marshall's house as an 18-year-old, and his first book was being suppressed because it didn't have copyright clearance, and he sold it out of the basement window. Can you
Which book was this?
The Mechanical Bride. He got the title from Duchamp. Can you imagine Margaret Atwood as an 18-year-old knocking on this little window in Toronto, the basement, and Marshall goes, here's your $10. Here's my book. That sounds like Handmaid's Tale. But Schopenhauer says all truth passes through 3 stages. First, it's ridiculed. Secondly, it's violently opposed. Thirdly, it's accepted as being self-evident. I knew that all along. I mean, that's quite an observation.
Yeah.
So we'll start with you, Rob. How do you determine what is true?
Time.
Wow, that was a good, concise answer. But suss it out a little. What do you mean?
Well, I mean, if you look at the scientific method, for something to become a law, it has to work for an extended period of time, like the law of gravity, right? It's still, has evolution become a law, or is it still technically a theory?
It'll always be a theory.
It'll always be a theory. But for example, with gravity, that's a law because it's passed so much time that it's like, well, we can't disprove this. We can only prove it. So that's my answer.
But it's funny because time, well, Facebook started as a high school, how to have friends with your teenagers, and then now it took over the world. So there's the time. But Matt, McLuhan said a great line. Evolution is adapting to exploration. So that's a pretty intense thing. He's like, how can we explore new questions and new metaphors? Okay.
Yeah. Evolution with a lowercase e, right?
Yeah, with both lowercase e's, definitely. Now, Matt, how do you determine what is true?
If she floats, she's a witch.
Now, what does that mean? I need that sussed out.
Well, I mean, I'm taking shelter in Monty Python.
Oh.
How much time do you have left, Jerry? I don't know if I can cover it.
Well, I'm leaving in 4 minutes. You guys keep going. But yeah, I'm just telling you that is, I mean, Rob said in one word, time. I mean, what's just...
No. I think maybe truth as an abstract idea is a little too far to approach. But authority, I might say, how do you determine authority would be a more helpful question. And then I think it has to do with personal decision making and how one attributes authority, whether or not one wants to take on sufficient knowledge oneself in order to make an authoritative decision, or to outsource it on faith with received wisdom. And in terms of social and scientific truths, material reality truths, there's nothing like the scientific method and verifiability and transparent discussion and good faith curiosity. And most importantly, I would say, is particularly among people who have been attributed to have authority, is the humility to accept being wrong, and publicly, which is hard for people with power or with a habit of respect.
That was beautiful, man. That was so well put. And listen, I don't want to stop you guys you can sum up much better. I just have to run, but I wanted to end my part with 2 little quotes about truth that sort of are interesting. Robert Evans, the great movie producer, there's 3 sides to every story: your side, my side, and the truth, and no one is lying. That sounds like a movie executive. Shelby Foote says, a fact is not a truth until you love it.
That's funny, yeah.
So they're tricky words. It's been a pleasure and an honor, and I love you both, and I hope we'll do this again, but please continue on. Later, sucker.
Thanks.
All right. So, Matt, how did this come up, I guess? Because, I mean, you guys were talking before and decided.
Right. So there was, Jerry does, he does a daily.
Salons, yeah.
Yeah, it's really a tetrad salon, right? He uses McLuhan's tetrad concept, and he goes round robin and chooses a medium or a technology or a concept, and we apply the tetrad to it, and it's fun. And so every now and then I'm able to dip in on that. I'm on the East Coast, so it's late in the afternoon, right when I'm kind of usually hitting my stride with whatever work I have. Right. But so today I was able to do it, and what were we talking? It was kind of about this thing with the social network. That's how it came up, and that's all. What part of it struck you particularly?
Well, I was going to ask you, if you did a tetrad, because I wasn't there, what were your answers to the 4 questions? And again, I'm not the biggest McLuhanite yet, but I do know that there's, what is it in its essence? I think.
No. What is it? Enhance or okay. What is it? Enhance or improve? No, enhance or modify. Mm-hmm. What does it?
Take away, right?
What is it? Obsolete.
Yeah.
What does it bring back? Yep. And then what does it flip into?
Yeah.
And so what's really great about the tetrad, no matter who's using it, the more you use it, the more you dislodge your mental habit from believing in sort of categories of valence that, oh, well, this thing is good and this thing is bad.
Right.
And and you realize that, well, everything's a tool and everything goes through cycles. Yeah. So it's a fun exercise. And so what was the one he did today?
Well, I was going to say, if you were to do a tetrad on social media, what would it be? So what does social media enhance?
The phone book.
Okay, phone book. What does it make obsolete?
The phone book.
Okay. What does it bring back?
The collective watering hole. The well.
Yeah.
Right. The gossip. The
bringing our gossip.
Yeah.
And what does it flip into when
Skynet?
Put into its Skynet. Dude, this is freaky, man, because we've all we go into these things with good intentions. I want to stay connected to people, but how many people do you know that have you brought up the term Luddite? They've rejected Facebook. Like my wife, she's like, nope, I don't want to be on Facebook, but she uses mine to message people.
Yeah,
which is kind of funny. But what is the future of all of this, do you think?
Maybe darker and darker consequences for the next 140 years, and then it'll flip. I don't know. I wouldn't use the label Luddite for people who opt out of these things.
Right.
You know, there's also the term walk away, and you know what? Let's take the analogy of drug addiction. You know, it's you're in recovery from addiction to these things, as you would if you turned off the television. Or if you, for instance, if you decided that you wouldn't participate in a social network, which at the outset tells you it's going to censor you based on what you say. So, you know, this organization in your banner at the bottom, you might decide, in anticipation for the day when you're at risk of being deplatformed, you would set up a parallel on Odyssey or any of the other number of video sharing platforms that for now work to maintain independent thinking.
Right.
I tend to take I think a really cynical view of these things, just based on my track record of that cynicism being a good predictor of what's coming. Whenever, you know, like, I wasn't surprised by 9/11. Everyone's like, we never saw it coming. It's like, well, you weren't paying attention then.
How old were you when 9/11 happened?
26.
Okay,
So I just got. Go ahead.
No, please.
Well, how old were you? Would you?
I was 11.
Okay.
So I was completely caught. I was like, I remember my dad saying, they're flying buildings into the Trade Center. I was like, well, that's a really weird way to demolish a building. Not real, you know what I mean? Like, just
right.
Your mind, speaking of McLuhan, it's formulating what is happening based on a priori experiences, if that's the right word. Like, whatever's happened in the past, you're trying to synthesize it into this new experience that you're having, because it wouldn't make sense that this had happened. And just like with Facebook, I mean, a young kid who maybe this is the way that they had always known things, suddenly something happens, they have to sort of formulate it with whatever they knew before. But you're saying that none of this was a surprise to you, and none of this is a surprise to you, or
yeah, no, the more down the especially the more past lockdown we get, the more I'm inclined to be like, I told you so.
Right.
But you know, so I was not 11, I was 26, 15 years older when that happened. I was in New York City. I could, the night before, I was on my fire escape looking down at the World Trade Center and saying to myself, God, I'm so lucky to have this cool apartment. I really need to photograph that. I almost put my leg back through the window in order to get my camera, my SLR. And my foot was in the window. I was like, you know what? Photography is so passing. Next week, I'm going to bring my easel out. I'm going to paint the World Trade Center.
Right.
So much for that. But no, I mean, at the time when I say the predictive aspect of it, that you could see it coming. Okay, so in high school and in college, I'd been to Europe a few times. I'd been outside the country enough to know that the shiny picture of America was not as glossy out there as it looked from the inside. In college, being an architecture student, had studied art history and foreign traditions of architecture, in particular Islamic architecture history. And I had spent a summer in Turkey, getting to know it and seeing that side of the world. And I tried to read, you know, at the time, magazines were still big and everyone read magazines. And so I liked to, you know, the way everyone does their balance now by, I'm going to read the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal and get both sides. At the time I was reading the Atlantic Monthly a lot. And at the time, and then the editor then, Michael Kelly, was very conservative in terms of his enthusiasm for war.
Right.
And I was reading Lewis Lapham's Harper's Monthly, Harper's Magazine. Harper's Monthly, which is the essayist one. And all of them very cynical and kind of fairly aware of U.S. history and its extravagances. And in those media, you know, the what it appears like now is that that intelligence was seeding all kinds of stuff. Like the image of Osama bin Laden as this great threat was there if you kind of pulled back a few pages of the New York Times. It was present. And so, of course, it was very easy when that event happened, you know, by the end of the day, it was determined without any kind of investigation or court proceedings or anything that this is exactly what happened.
Right.
So that morning, I had gone to an engineering meeting in New Jersey, and I'd kind of missed it. We got through the tunnel before it happened, and we didn't know it was happening until we arrived at our destination and saw it on television. And then the rest of my day was all about coming back in. But at the first moment, my thought was, oh my God, they did it. It worked. Talk about choosing a poetic day to do it on. You know, they chose the number of our emergency telephone number. Whoa, that's pretty wise. And I was like, okay, let's see what continues. And then, you know, by noon, nothing else happened. And I was like, no Chicago, no San Francisco, no Houston, none of the major ports. And I was like, oh, this is kind of like a television event. And then later that afternoon, in the early evening, seeing the select senators on the lawn in front of the Lincoln Memorial doing a press conference, but to no people. Like there was nobody allowed out. They were just, it was just like McCain, Hillary Clinton, and I forget who the third one was, but then a whole bunch of them behind, and they were all, you know, in front of the Lincoln Memorial, which of course, you know, Lincoln was the first imperialist of the nation. And by reasonable accounting, it's not to say the Union wasn't a good idea or something.
Right.
But so seeing that, I was like, oh my God, this is like made for television. And so, yes, I wasn't surprised at the idea that Osama bin Laden was doing this. And then I was also not traumatized at all by it, because I was like, wow, we got out. Should this continue, our timing couldn't have been better. But then it was safe to go back in the city. It was not easy to get back in the city that night. And I started looking at it from the infrastructural and institutional response and seeing how these things change, and finding a great deal of surprise when within, you know, immediately everyone wanted to go to war. And I was like, well, that's predictable. Yes. I didn't know people could be flipped so easily, but lo and behold. And the other part was funny, that was I had been in New York for a year at that point. And for me, that was a big achievement. Like, oh, I'm going to be a New Yorker, right? Like, here I am, like in the thick of it. Yeah. And part of the love of being there was like, I guess David Byrne said it well when he was asked where he was from. He's like, I don't really think of myself as from the USA. I'm from a small island off the east coast of the USA. and that's like what it was. And then all of a sudden, all these people that previously hated my adopted city now were like feeling it was theirs. And I was like, go to hell.
Right.
And lo and behold, they did go to hell.
Yeah.
Patriotism. Yeah, it's funny. So in a lot of ways, what 9/11 was, I think in some sense, was about the cultural capture of New York, and its and what had previously been this sort of like outsider place that Americans didn't identify with. They resented it. Understandably, they resented it because it was different and progressive, and it was on the cusp, and it was a place of real power. And so it's interesting. It's called the Empire City, and now it's it's more and more the center of the empire.
I mean, the parallels between Edward Gibbon's The Rise and Fall of the Roman Empire and America right now is just like, well, first of all, I should state, I don't know if Jerry told you, but I'm Canadian, right? And so, you know, Canada and America, they're inseparable, really.
Right.
And
unless you watch South Park.
Yes. Even then, I think that's hilarious.
No,
but
good.
This idea of, for me, 9/11 was like this decanter, this demarcator, time between, like, everything was just, you know, pink and fluffy roses. Everything was great. I was like, talk about, we use this term so loosely, privilege. Man, I had it good. I had no idea. And then after this happened, to me, it was the dawn of the age of anxiety. After
well,
that,
it's funny because you were hardly pubescent and all of a sudden you're experiencing the existential anxiety.
Yeah.
But when I was 11, it was the threat of nuclear holocaust. It was, and then all of a sudden, once 9/11 happened, everyone forgot about nuclear holocaust. I'm like, wait a minute, it's not gone.
Yeah.
What's going on here?
Yeah.
No, that's funny that at 11 you felt that way. But that's what happens when you're a kid and you're not only discovering the world in its fundamental essence, you're also discovering the world in its second nature, that is what culture imposes. And then you're also trying to figure out what your identity is in relation to those two things.
Yeah.
It's anything can happen.
Now, you know, what I've seen and what you've seen as well is the proliferation of things like cell phones. Like in 2007, the first Apple came out and it was a big deal. Yeah, I got my Apple. We all wanted one.
Yeah.
Now it's just like we're inseparable from this thing. It's like the car and the horse at the dawn of the early 20th century. My daughter, who's 2 years old, she can watch a show on an iPhone, get a little blurb, like ding, notification, and she can swipe up on it. She can't even properly articulate herself.
Yeah, I know. I've heard about some young infants trying to swipe pages of a book.
It's like a symbiosis or something.
No, that's true. Yeah, no, it's exocognitive. We're that's where McLuhan's so great about illustrating these things. Is that these in book culture you didn't see it as much with the phonetic alphabet. It wasn't visible with the manuscript. It wasn't really obvious. But now because we can see each generation as they change from year to year, we can see very clearly that it's the externalization of mind and the integration with the circuit, or whatever that means.
Okay, see, I'm kind of dumb. So can you explain that for me one more time? The externalization of information?
Of cognition. Externalization of cognition.
Okay. So is that what you're saying is we're seeing the humankind evolve before our very own eyes?
See, I wouldn't call it evolution. I would call it dynamic change. Evolution takes on the quality of divinity, right? What is natural, like natural being? Genes. Yeah. The genetic evolution. Yeah, exactly.
Okay. Yeah. You know what? You got a point. So
it's change. Evolution in the biological sense is a very, very particular thing.
Yes. And
it's not all change. It's not all. No. I mean, its concept is a particular thing.
Right.
So when Richard Dawkins talks about evolution, he's referring to this idea that, for all intents and purposes, life happened once. That the spark of life occurred by some miracle, like a biological Big Bang, and it's a miracle in his cosmology, or just dumb chance, right? And which is a miracle, and then from that moment of that first thing, it sort of proliferated and changed, and everything comes from that moment, like a bush out of its trunk. There have been competing ideas about how life occurs and how the changes in living forms occur that are obvious when you look at them. And there's different attitudes to how the taxonomy of life came to be. Another viable one is that life occurs at somewhat great regularity in different contexts and in different under different stresses, and that there's not a linear relationship between the early life forms and us, that it's able to occur rather maybe with pretty great regularity in times of upheaval, and then each of those has their own branch, maybe, right?
Right.
But then there's other versions that aren't contemplated, like, for instance, is life endemic to water, and can life occur at any time that the conditions are right, and we just don't know what that is? That's a possibility. Mm-hmm. Another possibility. Well, and then, so that's about origins, and then you get into matter of deviations or mutations or whatever it is. You know, is that something that is a species-wide event? Right. You know, if you're a material reductivist, then there's no relationship between things outside of our physical bodies, right? Whereas if you're either into, maybe, what do you call it? Morphic resonance, as Sheldrake describes it, or you're aware of the electromagnetic model in a cosmological sense, then you can understand that in invisible realms, the ones that our senses aren't capable of perceiving, that there are in fact relationships, energetic relationships, that could, in the right social context, be discovered as materially true. We don't have that social context right now, for what it's worth. So that's why I hedge against using the term evolution, because it's really loaded. Because what we're doing is we're automatically deferring to and giving credence and authority to Richard Dawkins and his cohort. And they're the ones that studied dog breeding, and they're the ones that studied genetic manipulation, and they're the ones that, you know, work at the Wellcome Trust, and, you know, and they're the ones that are all on Bill Gates' payroll.
They have their own interests. Yeah, fair enough.
They have their own interests, and they're probably really paranoid, evil, wealthy people who don't understand that their desire to fix things is going to screw it up really badly.
Well, I mean, if Jerry was here, he would say that, like, there's nothing to fix because there's no problem.
I love Jerry's retreat into, we're not making a value judgment, and I think it's really important to be able to have some kind of distance, right, and objectivity, and non-attachment. Like, non-attachment's the really good constructive thing there.
But see, now that for me that's what I've really learned in my time, you know, working with Jerry and things like that, is I realize, why do I care so much about this? You know, like,
yeah, well, identity, right? Your identity gets wrapped up with your thoughts, and you think you are your thoughts.
They want you to care, right?
Yeah, they do.
You know, like, they want you to be so irate and so pissed off, and it's like, I think that what we need to do to sort of slow this whole process down is to become a little bit more, please correct me on this, but become conscious consumers.
Yeah.
I think that I'll speak for myself. I've been an unconscious consumer for how does capitalism stay afloat? You got to keep buying stuff, right?
Right.
To keep it going. Yeah. And now it's like, I ask myself, do I really need any of these things?
Yeah. I guess you can take your own inventory and see how much you actually use any one part of it.
But that's just it. You can only take your own inventory. You can't take anybody else's.
Oh, no. Yeah, no. Ultimately, I thought of it earlier when Jerry was talking about truth, I guess, about authority and all that. I love Terence McKenna's line. I don't know if you know Terence McKenna. Are you familiar with him at all?
That name is super familiar.
Okay, Terence McKenna is kind of like highly academic, highly idiosyncratic psychonaut of the. He became a public figure in the 90s after he and his brother had written the book, literally the book under pseudonym on how to grow psilocybin mushrooms. And so really ushered in the cottage industry of psychedelic culture. And then he became this speaker and would, talk at Esalen and do workshops and talk all around, promoting his perception of what it all meant. And he was sort of an explorer, and he was taking taxonomies, and he was trying to understand what these substances were and what it meant in the context of art history and the history of culture, and in the context of the internet and so on. And he's definitely an acquired taste because he's avowedly an outsider, and is the first to say that culture is not your friend. But then along those lines, the line that always tickled me was, any of those moments where you feel the pressure of coercion to believe or think something that doesn't quite resonate. He said, "You're going to go into the yawning grave all by yourself. So you're allowed to believe whatever you damn well please."
But it's true.
Yeah. But the thing is, most people don't want to think about that. Most people don't want to think about the fact that they're alone doing it. Most people don't want to take on the burden of saying, no, I don't consent. I don't know what I believe, but I don't agree with that.
Because that takes courage. I mean,
it takes courage. It takes self-esteem. It takes you're taking the risk of being wrong.
Have you? Yeah, I mean, which is not easy, right? Like, really?
No, especially in English-speaking words. I want to make a comment real quick about that because it's funny. The word in English, I don't know if in other languages it's the same, but in English it's really obvious that we use the words right and wrong in factual contexts and in moral contexts. And so there's a lot of people that grow up thinking that being wrong in the factual sense has a moral component, which it doesn't.
Wrong. Yeah.
And so you got all these control freak men and women who are like hell bent on never being wrong, as if they've never been ignorant of something and they were born out of the womb.
That's also
it's a huge weakness. It's a tremendous weakness. It prevents.
And this.
I was going to say, McLuhan.
No, after you. Sorry.
McLuhan said, every time a new discovery is made, whole new fields of ignorance are opened up.
100%.
Right. And you can't, if you're not ignorant, how can you learn? You have to come from a place of not knowing before you can know.
Which is interesting because, to bring it back to my favorite McLuhanite, Socrates, is he was wise because he was not afraid to be wrong. He actually never really gave an answer. If you look back at Socrates, the Socratic method was him just asking questions. I don't know if you have kids, but you talk to a kid and they're like, you got to look both ways before you cross the road. Why? Well, because there might be a car. And they just keep at the why. They're trying to understand truth. They're not trying to be, little sheds. Right. They're trying to get to the meaning of it all. But I think in life, at some point, we're like, oh my God, I can't question everything. I have to go along to get along here. And the road to hell is paved in good intentions.
Yeah, that's right. I know when I was a kid asking why all the time, it was partly out of curiosity, but it was also partly out of the attention, for the attention,
Have you ever read this book here? This is.
Who's the author?
By Robert Sapolsky. Great.
Oh, book. Wait a minute. Show me that again. Sorry. Sapolsky, Behave, the Biology of Humans at Our Best and Worst.
He's out of Stanford.
I was wondering about the name Sapolsky because the Coen Brothers film, I don't know if you saw it, The Ballad of Buster Scruggs.
I did not see it. I asked somebody, this is what I did. I did the Rotten Tomatoes thing. Oh, is that movie good? It was really weird. Never watched it.
Oh yeah, no, it's great. The later, I don't know. I'm a big fan of the later Coen Brothers work.
Burn After Reading. Is it Burn After Reading?
Mm-hmm.
That was a good movie.
That's a good one.
Because it's just like you're trying to talk about cognitive dissonance. You're trying to put the story together when really there's nothing to put together.
Right.
It's completely unrelated events. So, tell me.
So what's going there? One of the things that's fun about maybe in all of their films, but I notice in particular there's a pattern that starts with a serious man, Inside Llewyn Davis, Hail Caesar, and then it's also strong in Ballad of Buster Scruggs, where the selection of names in the literary symbolic way is that a lot of names are chosen to be sort of reference points for other things in culture, and that you can really only understand the subtext when you kind of dive into that name. And so in the I won't, there's no spoiler here, but in the Ballad of Buster Scruggs is 6 shorts in the Western mode, and in the final one there's it's 3 strangers in the back of a stagecoach, and in front of them on the seat behind the driver there's 2 gentlemen that know one another, and they're transporting a body on top of the stagecoach that is being taken to be buried, and presumably, and so the 3 people are a woman who is married to a prominent academic. There's a trapper, and there's a Frenchman who talks about gambling. And the Frenchman says, "I was once at a hand of poker with a man named Chapulski." And now that you bring up Sapolsky, I have to assume that may well be what they were referring to, and I'm dying to look at it. I will give you a spoiler in anticipation of watching it, and also for your audience if they're interested. There are people that might watch this, right?
Oh yeah.
Oh yeah. Okay, cool. So there's the body that's being transported. They refer to as Mr. Thorpe, and the name Thorpe has a sort of storied past insofar as the character, a personage named Thomas Thorpe, was said to be the publisher of Shakespeare's sonnets, and so on the title page of the sonnets is, published, or I forget what the words are exactly. It's enciphered, so it's a weird bunch of words, but it's by T.T. Thomas Thorpe is what they say it is. And so you go, okay, so maybe there's this Shakespeare reference. Well, there's also a short story by Borges called Shakespeare's Brain, or The Mind of Shakespeare's Brain. Brain's not the right word, but anyway, you get the idea. You can find it. Maybe, yeah. Shakespeare's Mind, but you can find it online.
Okay.
And let's see. And the jokes that they're making become kind of clear when you realize that they might be referring to the publisher of Shakespeare. But in the Borges story, it's a story about a man who's now not feeling well. You're meeting him at a bar. He's coming to you, or to the person he's coming to, with a story and something to give him. And he says, "I once went to a bar and a man named Thorpe met me there, and he had been met by a man before him." And he explained the story that he had taken on Shakespeare's mind, the mind of Shakespeare, by agreement, and it had been conveyed by this other man. And at first he didn't notice it, but then as time started going on and he agreed to it, the other man dies, he agrees to it, and he starts to notice that his own memory starts to be confused with Shakespeare's memory, and he can't know himself very well anymore. And it's the knowledge of wisdom and so forth, but it's also kind of it's traumatic. And then of course so he had it, and now he has to give it away too, and he's trying to get this other person to say, you have to understand what you're doing, and you have to say out loud, I agree to take Shakespeare's mind. So that's that story with Thorpe again in there. And so what's crazy is these two bounty hunters are taking the corpse of Shakespeare on top of the stage, and their destination is Fort Morgan, Colorado. And you're like, so what the fuck is Fort Morgan, Colorado? Well, okay, so it's Morgan in German is morning, right? But it's also it's defensive mourning, or it's whatever, it's Fort Morgan. Okay, so you just have those words. Well, here's where it's really kind of crazy, and Fort Morgan is the resting place of Philip K. Dick's body, where he lies next to his infant twin who died when she was really young. And so there seems to be something that they're saying about the replacement, where, we up until the 20th century, we were living in Shakespeare's world. And now, it's just Philip K. Dick's world, and we just live in it.
Oh, the transfer.
It's the transfer. And so, the new cosmology, the sense of identity.
I got to read Philip K. Dick, man.
Philip K. Dick is great. The one that, wade through and read whatever you can, but the one that's the most sort of kind of esoteric and Gnostic and would be the thing that kind of the Coens would be referring to, I think, would be his book called Valis.
Valis.
And the history of Valis. You can listen to Philip K. Dick on YouTube talking about
he's
that
still
book.
with us?
No. All old recordings, old lectures. But talking about the story of how that book came to be. It was kind of his last book. It followed an exegesis. He went on this sort of manic rage, and over a period of weeks, maybe months, wrote something on the order of like 330,000 pages, or 3,000 pages. It couldn't be. It must have been more than 3,000 pages. A lot of pages of like he was kind of channeling prophecy, because he was a huge pillhead, but he was spiritually attuned, and so anyway, I think that final story in the Coen Brothers Ballad of Buster Scruggs is making some kind of comment about the age that was, and our view of the world that we inherited and was enlightened by Shakespeare, and the new world that we live in.
Yes, and the one that's coming next,
if it's not here already.
The Faustian deal. Right?
Yeah.
What devil have we paid?
Yeah, that's right.
Man, the thing I was going to drop about this is just, it talks about behavior and why we behave the way that we do. And, it's a little too thick for me, so I listen to the audiobook. I'm a cheater. But at one point, he talks about altruism and why we behave the way we do. Well, because we're getting something in return.
Yep. There's also,
but he talks about the cultural influence. It's a great book.
Yeah.
It's a good book. It's a good supplement.
Yeah.
It's a good supplement to the things that we talk about. Matt, I have to get going now myself. Yeah. Thank you so much for your time. Can we please do this again though?
I look forward to it.
Yeah, because if you don't mind my asking, what is it that you do for a living?
I'm a designer of buildings. Like I said, I study architecture.
Architecture.
I've never thought of myself as exclusively an architect, and I'm not a registered architect.
Nobody's a one-trick pony.
Yeah. But that's my sort of, that's the background I come from.
I'm just curious how you got into all of this.
That's a long story. I don't know. Now, these days, I self-identify more as a poet, I think, than as an architect.
Your picture in the background, your window, it looked like a guillotine for the longest time.
That's what
I was like, all right, yeah.
Let's hope it's not prophetic.
Nah, it won't be. You're safe.
Thank you.
Just come to Canada, man.
Man, they're all the Five Eyes. I don't know. There was a guy, I forget his name, a comic and activist who was clearly ranting about the policies of the United States. And so people would always ask, of course, if you don't love it here, why don't you leave? And he said, because I'd rather be subject to America's domestic policy than its foreign policy.
No joke. Eh? That's a great point.
It's a great line. Yeah.
Well,
cool.
Pierre Trudeau said, we sleep next to an elephant or something like that. You know, so being Canada is like sleeping next to an elephant or a giant, you know.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's funny. It's an elephant with no memory. So what do you do with that? It's a paradox.
Well, hey, cool. Man, thank you so much. And we got to do it again. Okay.
I look forward to it, Rob. Thanks a lot. Pleasure meeting you.
All right. Thank you. You take care.